Hello.
Well, how are you today?
I'm well. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
It is St. Patrick's
It
Day,
is,
isn't
and
it?
you're not wearing any green.
Uh-oh, you're
Am I
going to
allowed to
pinch me?
pinch you?
No. Actually, I
what do you have?
Look at that.
There you go, a pocket square.
I got my pocket square
Perfect.
that's a little bit green, right?
Do you have to wear green if you're Irish? I don't know if everybody knows Richard is part Irish.
Yep, my mom is half Irish, so
Yeah.
yep, I do have that.
Yeah. In fact, growing up, I don't know if people know this, they called him Murphy because he was born into an Italian family with red hair. They're like, what's this? We
Didn't
gotta
go
call
over
him
too
Murphy.
well. Who's this albatross we have in this family here?
Wow.
Yeah. So I see you have your Ukrainian mug. We both
I do, yes, in support of Ukraine. And thank you for the segue into our topic today. We are here to talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We are really excited about our guest today. It is John Emerson. John works in global distribution as vice chairman of Capital Group International. He has 20 years of industry experience, all with Capital Group. He most recently served as the United States ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany. In 2015, John was awarded the State Department's Susan M. Cobb Award for Exemplary Diplomatic Service, which is given annually to one non-career ambassador. And in 2017, he was awarded the CIA Medal and the U.S. Navy's Distinguished Public Service Award. Prior to accepting the ambassadorial posting, John was president of Capital Group Private Client Services. Before joining Capital, he was deputy assistant to President Clinton, where he coordinated his economic conferences, served as the president's liaison to the nation's governors, and led the administration's efforts to obtain congressional approval of the GATT Uruguay Round Agreement and the extension of China's MFN trading status. Additionally, he was appointed by President Obama to serve on his advisory committee for trade policy and negotiations. Before working in the Clinton White House, John served as Los Angeles chief deputy attorney and was a partner in the law firm of Monte, Phelps, Rothenberg, and Phillips. John holds an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from Hamilton College, a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Chicago, and a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Hamilton College. John is currently based in Los Angeles. Ambassador, welcome to A Place of Possibility. We are just thrilled to have you here to help our listeners better understand what is going on in Ukraine right now. We're so excited you're here.
Well, unfortunately, that bio was so long, we don't have any more time. You are quite distinguished, John. Ambassador, I'm sorry, I shouldn't be calling you John. It's ambassador.
No. You call me John. I only use ambassador when I'm trying to get restaurant reservations.
Okay, fair enough. All right, great. That's great. So first off, you were the U.S. ambassador to Germany in 2014 to 2017?
2013 to 2017, which put me there when the whole Ukraine crisis started.
Wow. Okay.
Had the opportunity to visit Kyiv in the wake of that, to work with the fledgling Ukrainian government, which started out, formed a democracy after Yanukovych, who really was the kleptocrat who was sort of a Putin crony who'd been running his flag. Yeah. So it was a very interesting time.
Yeah. Well, so that begs the question, what's the deal with Vladimir Putin? I mean, it seems like he's a throwback to another century. What is he doing in the 21st century? And, have you personally met him?
I haven't. I would have when Germany hosted the G7 back in 2015. But because it was after the Ukraine crisis began, when Putin annexed Crimea and moved into the Donbass, he was kicked out of it used to be the G8, and they made it the G7. So I did not have an opportunity to meet him. However, I was working very closely with Angela Merkel, who she knew him quite well. And in fact, they spoke one another's language with nuance. She'd grown up in the former East Germany, where they learn Russian, not English, as their second language. So obviously, through not just our intelligence efforts, but obviously through her and her national security advisor and the ongoing negotiations for the Minsk Accords, I had some insights into him through that.
Yeah, wonderful. So what's it's easy to throw around comparisons with Hitler with him, but what's the deal with him? What's he trying to accomplish, and what's the end game, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I always hesitate, having lived in Germany and met many who survived the Holocaust with these Hitler analogies, but maybe a Stalin analogy is more appropriate in his case. But I think there's several things going on. I mean, first of all, this is a guy who has said repeatedly that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the dissolution of the USSR, not two world wars, not the Holocaust, not the dropping of the atomic bomb, but the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Secondly, he's always believed, in fact, he wrote a long essay to this effect just about a year and a half ago, that Ukraine was part of Russia, that Ukraine was a made-up country, that Russia really, the first major city of Russia was Kyiv, and that Ukraine belongs certainly in the orbit of Russia, if not belongs as part of Russia. So you have that philosophically. The third thing is, just in terms of his own survival and geopolitical interests, the last thing he wants to see is a major populous nation on his border that turns into a thriving westward-leaning democracy.
Oh, interesting.
And the reason he went in and grabbed Crimea and infiltrated the Donbass when Yanukovych fled back in 2014 was because there was talk about Ukraine joining the EU. And when Yanukovych acceded to Putin's demands and said, well, no, we're not going to do that, you had a public uprising on the Maidan. Remember, the snipers were killed over 100 people, who were innocent protesters out there. And that's when Putin acted, because the last thing he wants to see is a popular, democratically driven uprising to throw out an autocratic ruler on his border, because he doesn't want the Russian people to get any ideas. That's why when Lukashenko in Belarus lost his election, Putin moved in to support him, while the guy, I'm blanking on his name, the president of Kazakhstan just a few months ago, there were protests all over. He sent troops in to suppress that, and he doesn't want to see that in Ukraine, which begs the question of what's his ultimate objective. I think his ultimate objective here is regime change, because Zelensky's clearly moving in that direction and doing everything he can to make sure that Ukraine is a broken country, maybe even a partition country, and so that there's no way that it can move westward or be a thriving, economically successful democracy.
Interesting. So do you think that we've seen reports that the Russians actually expected the Ukrainians to welcome them and throw down their arms, a big percentage of them? You think that was legitimate, that they actually thought that? And they certainly aren't getting that.
It happened a little bit in Crimea.
Yeah.
And it happened a little bit in the Donbass. I mean, there were still lives lost, Russian soldiers killed and all that. But the fact of the matter is Ukraine, oddly enough, one of the great things that Vladimir Putin has managed to accomplish is taking a country that was largely pro-Russian and turning it into a country that now hates Russia, much the way Poland hates Russia. And in any event, but particularly the eastern part of Ukraine, with those separatist areas and all that, you had a lot of former Russian citizens who lived there, and that did happen. And I think there were two fundamental miscalculations that he made. One, and we can talk in more detail about both of them if you're interested, but one is clearly how quickly the West came together and how solidly the West is together with regard to not just condemning the attack, but the sanctions that they're imposing. And then secondly, the extent of the resistance and the resilience and the fighting capacity of Ukraine.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Are you thinking that, I'm getting the sense when you were talking about how he wants to have Ukraine be a broken country, Putin does. I got the image of like the Lion King with Scar, presiding over this charred area. Is that kind of like what he's trying to do?
Well, I think what we'd rather do, and what maybe he thought initially he could do, was a blitzkrieg, come in and then, decapitate the Zelensky the Zelensky government, impose a puppet government, and bang, he would have, Ukraine be a part of greater Russia, if you will. He wants to make Russia great again, is essentially what
like Belarus is.
And yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And now that didn't happen, and now that he's suffered all these losses, unfortunately, this is not a guy who is about to turn around and go, you know what, boy, did I make a big mistake here. Let's pull the troops back. He's just going to keep pressing forward. And that's, I fear, the most likely result of his continuing to press forward.
Wow.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, how have the Ukrainians been able to hold him off for so long? I mean, when I was thinking through this question, I wrote down ragtag band of citizens, which is probably not doing them enough credit. But, how long can they hold off one of the most powerful armies in the world?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, their army is pretty big and pretty well trained, and was cleaned up after the 2014-2015 debacle, when it was not only it turned out it was not only some Ukrainian citizens who welcomed Russian troops with flowers and all. There were also some generals who were very pro-Russian within the Ukraine, thinking about how they got there in the first place and all that. And so those guys are out. And so you have, I think, a much greater, a much better and much better trained armed force. And by the way, they've been, we've been giving them weapons. Germany wasn't, some other countries weren't, but other countries were giving them weapons over time. So they're better defended, if you will, from a weapons standpoint. The third thing is, there's a big difference between fighting a war far away from home, or maybe even not that far away from home in Russia's case, but, in another country, and repelling an invading force that's trying to take over your home and destroying your community.
Sure.
And the level of intensity between the Ukrainian forces and people who are, you are not going to do this, and we're going to stand up and we're going to push back and we're going to fight, versus a lack of intensity we're hearing from the Russian soldiers, many of whom are conscripts. Basically, they had a draft there, and they just sort of joined up, and they weren't told, here's what you're doing and here's why you're doing it. Most of them thought these were exercises, along the border. Really? They had no idea they were going in. And once they're in there, it's like, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? And then the third thing, Angela, to your comment about the great and mighty Russian army, not so great and mighty, we're finding out. They, yes, they have nuclear weapons. So that obviously is something we have to be concerned about. But logistically, they say, that before an invasion begins, it's all about the planning. After invasion begins, it's all about logistics. You got to get gasoline to your vehicles. You got to get food to your troops. You've got to get resources to your troops. You got to get ammo and new weaponry to your troops. And apparently, from a logistical standpoint, this has been something close to a disaster. And so, the Ukrainians, by the way, we say we're giving them weapons. Their best source of weapons these days is weapons they're recovering from the Russians.
I've seen them taking over tanks and things. Is that real?
Yeah.
And so I saw a commentator, military commentator on the news this morning, and he made the point, they talk about, there have been, the Russians have suffered roughly, 10% casualties of their troops. So they had 150,000 troops. That's 15,000 people. By the way, just to put this in context, 15,000 people, how many dead, how many wounded, not sure. But in 3 weeks, in 20 years of the Afghan war, we lost 2,400 lives.
Yeah. Wow.
They've already lost well over 5,000 lives. So, I mean, that just puts that in a little bit of context. But what he was saying was 10%. It isn't 10% across the board. There may be some areas where very few Russians have been killed. There may be other areas where 40% of the invading force was killed. And in those cases, the Ukrainian army is just picking up that equipment, at least the equipment that wasn't destroyed, and using it against them. They even caught and captured and now control one of their major surface-to-air, anti-aircraft weapons that they're using.
Awesome.
Boy, that's something.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how it's been happening. Now, I have to say, at the end of the day, Russia's got the military might. They've got the people. They've got the bodies to throw at it. They've got the weaponry to throw at it. They're obviously following try to demoralize the country by destroying the civilians
doing a good job
approach. and just brings cities to their knees by just, bombarding civilian targets. You saw the thing this morning in the news of the tragedy with that theater that they bombed, that literally had outside of it in big Cyrillic letters on the ground written "children" inside, and a very easy target, not a lot around it. You can't argue that was missed.
Nope.
That was a miss.
Yep.
And that's the approach that they're now taking. And sadly, over time, that approach and that relentless bombardment it's likely to succeed, but it would probably, that's why I say at the end of the day, we may end up with a partitioned country or something. But the cost of this for Vladimir Putin, and we haven't even begun to talk about sanctions and the economic impact of that, but the cost from a military standpoint, from an embarrassment standpoint, from exposing to the world how unprepared Russia's conventional forces are, is enormous at this point.
I keep thinking the word inept just comes to mind. So let's talk about sanctions. We've seen sanctions, being used over the years, in other countries, Iran and North Korea, and they never, from my perspective, they never seem to do a whole lot. Maybe they did, but it didn't seem like they got.
Well, they did in South Africa. They, sanctions.
That's right. You're right. That's right. I do remember that.
Brought down and boycott, brought down apartheid. But I think you're right. The fundamental question is, what's the purpose? Because sanctions, and I think we've seen a revolving purpose or an evolving purpose here. So the initial purpose of the sanctions and the threat of sanctions was deterrence. Okay, we're going to do this, and this to you if you do this. Now, honestly, I'm not sure Vladimir Putin believed that.
Right.
And the reason he didn't believe it is Europe gets 47% of its oil and gas from Russia. He's like, the European nations aren't going to risk that. They're not going to suffer, have their populace suffer. Yeah. They don't have the, the attitude or the, ability to kind of endure that. So they're not ultimately going to be with the United States. And by the way, even with the United States, they had that terrible withdrawal from Afghanistan. I can't imagine there's zero appetite in America for another foreign military engagement. Yeah, they talk a good game. We'll see what I don't believe they're actually going to impose all that. Yeah. So another thing that had to be a surprise to him was the rapidity with which the most extreme sanctions, including throwing Russian banks off the SWIFT program, were imposed. So deterrence. Then the second thing is punishment. So once he's going in, now you got to, number one, for deterrence to be effective in the future, you better deliver when you threaten it in the past, right? So, so that it serves that purpose, and then it's also punishment, and then the third part in this case is I think trying to bring pressure on Putin to, if not, he's not going to completely back down, but sort of look for some sort of an off ramp where he can declare some sort of limited victory and then basically stop the invasion. And that's the sanctions on all the oligarchs. That's crushing the Russian economy, because even authoritarians have their own politics to deal with. Don't really genuinely have to run for re-election against a well-known competitor, because they either shoot them or, arrest them, or, they control the news media, they control the information flows. But believe me, there are power centers within Russia that at the end of the day, Vladimir Putin's got to keep,
satisfied
and satisfied. You're right. And you start, and it's more than the oligarch not being able to send their kid to Oxford and not being able to access their yacht or land their plane in Europe or Canada or the United States. It's, that's obviously, there's an inconvenience to it, but not being able to access their resources and just seeing the Russian economy inevitably, as Russia gets increasingly isolated, going like this, the idea, the hope is that the severity of these sanctions will create some internal dissension and pressures on Putin that could ultimately hasten an end to this.
You can sure hope, but there's a lot of disinformation going on, right?
Yeah. Oh, sure. And then, of course, you had his speech this morning where I mean, not only are they just total disinformation, and others, his allies are doing. I just saw a news flash come across that the president of South Africa said, "Well, it's the NATO countries that started this war,"
Yeah.
and of course China was singing that tune. It was very interesting when Biden, it was a very shrewd move on Biden's part, when Biden was releasing the intelligence in the run up to this invasion, saying they're about to invade. He's about to invade. He's just made the decision. It's just a question of when. China was saying that's nonsense. That's not the case. Or whatever. They're like, whoops.
Yeah.
Now, but I think one of the more interesting questions is how China's going to deal with all this.
Well, that's one we wanted to ask you. Yeah.
Yeah. Please, let's talk about that.
What do you think?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, it seems like, John, that that how could this help them to be on Putin's side with this thing? How could your standing in the world increase or do anything good for them if they're on his side?
Well, that's an important element of, I think, the conundrum that they're under. Now, don't forget, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin had their confab on the eve of the Olympics, the Winter Olympics.
Right.
They came out with a 5,000-word communique, and two things of note. Number one, it was they talked about a partnership for life without condition.
Yeah.
So this was something that was going to be creating in effect a different world order, different from the rule of law world order that had been created by the West, and we're going to have an alternative way of doing business out there. I mean, that was huge, consequential, and something to be very worried about, geopolitically in a long-term basis. Second thing that was interesting, though, about it was silent as to Ukraine. Now, China is Ukraine's largest trading partner. China imports a ton of grain and wheat and barley from Ukraine. Second thing is, but notwithstanding that, I'm sure that Xi Jinping, who of course has his eyes on Taiwan, was sitting there going, "Hey, this is a freebie. I can have Vladimir Putin be the point of the spear and go forward on this, and let's see how the West responds. Are they really going to impose the sanctions that they're talking about imposing? Are they really going to come together, or will they be split? Because both Russia and China have as geopolitical objectives to separate Europe from the United States.
Yep.
And even within Europe to divide and conquer among the different countries. China does it through economic means. Russia does it, well, also I suppose economic, but through energy politics. But China is Germany's largest trading partner now. As an example,
Wow.
Italy. China is Italy's largest trading partner. So there are there's this desire on China's part to have these good relationships with Europe. So the good news for Putin is, Xi Jinping is he went to school, he got his lesson, and he learned two things. One, whoa, I guess they will deliver on the intensity and severity of the sanctions. That's something I better keep in mind. That's why I say I think all this has made an invasion of Taiwan less likely, not
Hopefully.
more likely.
Yeah.
But the flip side is, he says, they're afraid to get into a military conflict. They won't get into a military conflict with a nuclear power. So maybe if I do something in Taiwan, I won't be engaging the American forces, for instance. So, I mean, that's something maybe you wish you wouldn't take away from it, but that he is probably also taking away from it.
Yeah.
But now I have to believe he's not too happy about it, because of the point you raised, which is Vladimir Putin is now a pariah in Europe, and all these countries that China wants to do business with and is continuing to do business with. And I know I can tell you from a German standpoint, they're, inviting German companies to come and build factories and really invest in China and all that.
Interesting.
There are now, those companies are going, man, if you're Vladimir Putin's pal and you're behind him every step of the way in this process, we don't want to be doing business with you. So they're worried about getting crosswise of sanctions, or beyond that, as you put it, reputational risk.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is, Xi Jinping is trying to kind of build the Chinese economy. It got overheated. It's come back. They've had some problems. They just recently, this week, agreed to sort of help the banking system, and which the stock market appreciated, I suppose. in any event, the last thing he wants is a global recession. And
True.
yet, if you start weaponizing energy and you see the spike in energy prices and you see the impact of sanctions and the likely retaliation by Putin against the sanctioning nations, all this could lead to a global recession. And since China builds stuff they want to sell to the rest of the world, that's not a good thing.
Not good.
So I now maybe the silver lining is they'll get to buy a lot of Russian oil and gas at fire sale prices, but this generally is not a good thing. And I think the thing to watch is what the intelligence community put out, which is that Russia has asked China for weapons, for help in terms of weaponry. Keep an eye on that one, because I think if China goes in that direction, I think this is what Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, said to his counterpart in Rome earlier this week in their 7-hour meeting. You guys go down that road, you are getting involved in this thing, and you will run afoul of sanctions. So be very interesting to see whether they in fact come through on that, or whether their support of Russia is basically just, verbal support of Russia.
Interesting. Interesting. What about the whole issue of energy in Western Europe and East and Central Europe also?
Well, this is
how do they get off this?
I mean, it's a problem. They can, but not immediately. I mean, it's and it's more of an issue than wearing a sweater and turning the
Jimmy Carter approach.
How long can we last? Yeah. I mean, and are there legitimate alternatives?
Don't have air conditioning very much, as you've probably noticed over there in the summer. And but they need the heat. So that's I mean, the good news is we're moving into the spring. But the bad news is there is not a ready replacement for Russian and oil and gas at the level that Europe
needs it.
Is dealing with. We can figure that out in the United States. It's only 1 million barrels a day we get from Russia. It's maybe less than 5% of our oil and gas needs. We can figure that out. We can ultimately deal with it through domestic production. They can't. And so, I think they're talking to Norway, but Norway has 95% of the natural gas that it produces is already committed. So now some of it's committed to European gas, but it's already committed, right? So that doesn't fill that gap. But there'll be some coming from there. U.S. has talked to Japan about diverting some of its natural gas supplies, liquefied natural gas, over to Europe. But in Germany, for instance, they did not complete building the regasification facilities they were building at one of their ports in the North Sea. They're now diving into that, doubling down on that. So this could be one area where you do see a gap between what Europe's willing to do and what the U.S. is willing to do in terms of, sanctioning or banning their energy production. This is one reason why I think, again, the U.S. is pushing hard to try to get the Iran nuclear deal done again. Not only because once we stepped out of the Iran nuclear deal, they moved that much faster and closer to developing a nuclear weapon. But now there's also, if you reduce the sanctions, that's a bunch of oil that comes on global markets that they'd be perfectly happy to sell. So
that would help.
It's interesting how this changes a lot of things. I mean, in terms of who we're friendly with and who we're not.
Isn't that, I saw we're talking to Venezuela last week, right? So
exactly. Now the White House got a lot of pushback from that. I was in South Florida earlier this week, and I heard about that as well. We don't even recognize the Maduro government, but the White House is saying we weren't discussing oil. We were discussing releasing these prisoners that they had, or hostages that they had, which they did. But I don't know if we necessarily have to buy that oil, but if they agree to pump more and put it in global markets,
that helps.
Obviously, sure, of course it helps. And oil price came down the last couple of days a little bit, but still way up there, as every American who drives a car knows. They see that inflation report card every 5 or 6 blocks on the
sure do.
the gas station.
Report
Right?
card. I love that.
It's pretty.
Yeah.
You can't deny it for sure.
Yeah.
No.
Well, can we talk more about the impact on Americans and specifically American investors? I mean, by and large, the people listening here are, your mom and pop hardworking Americans. They just want their retirement to outlive them. What do you think the long-term serious repercussions to the U.S. stock market and investors are going to be as a result of the war?
Well, I think it's more short and medium term, to be honest with you. I think long term we'll get through this. We'll deal with this just as we did with the global financial crisis, just as we did with the .com bust, which lasted a couple of years. If you're on retirement, living on a fixed income, guess what? Your interest payments are going up because as interest rates go up, that means you're going to get paid more. Obviously, you're worried about inflation, sort of hollowing that out. But I think if you're invested, if you've got a financial advisor you're working with and you've got a good long-term plan and you're on track with that long-term plan, I wouldn't make any sudden moves here. I would stick with that plan. Ultimately, you're going to be all right. If you are in a situation where, you were planning on buying a house in 6 months, or you got to send your kids to school and you needed to, cash out, that's a different story. And that you definitely what you need to do there, I think, is sort of look at, maybe there's some assets we can sell that aren't likely to come back as fast and harvest some losses for tax purposes, but raise the cash that way. Those are nuanced, complicated decisions. But I would say from a long-term standpoint, hang in there. I think what's likely to happen long-term is you're going to see more and more reshoring of supply chains, probably increase in incomes to Americans. I think inflation will get under control. I mean, it may take 1.5 to 2 years to do it. We heard from the chairman of the Fed yesterday. They're talking about a 2% raise over the next couple of years.
Right.
But that inflation will be gotten under control. The supply chain imbalances will balance out again. They clearly, in every crisis, there are also lots of investment opportunities. So I know this is one thing we work hard on at Capital Group, is trying to, think about keeping people invested, but making the kinds of changes that are both protecting them in the short and medium term, but also taking advantage of what the likely long-term trends are going to be. And I clearly, from a long-term standpoint, greater independence from dependence on oil and gas, that's something that had started a while ago. I think once we get through this crisis, that may accelerate, those kinds of things. Yep. So stick with it. If you got a plan, stick with it.
What do you think? It sounds to me like we're going to come out of this stronger than we were before, because we're going to have our supply chains. We're doing less dealing with some of these bad guys who are using the wealth, the wealth that we're helping them create to do bad things, evil things in the world, right? So it seems like we're going to come out of this stronger and more resilient than we were before.
I think that's entirely possible. And I think you raise a really good point there. I think there's been a lot of conversation about this authoritarianism versus democracy. And, one of the problems is when you come in times of uncertainty, authoritarianism sort of feels good because you want the, a strong leader to come in and say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, be able to implement it quickly. Mm-hmm. Now you see the dangers of having an authoritarian leader and the havoc that can be wreaked as their ego, as their personal view of the world and how they want to make it and what they want their legacy to be sort of takes control. And then as a response, Putin's speech this morning was extraordinary when he talked about cleansing Russia.
I saw that.
From traitors. Traitor being defined as anybody who says, wait a minute, are we doing the right thing here? That's what authoritarianism is. And I do think that, in bringing democracies together, in bringing the rule of law community together, that ultimately does strengthen us. And this has had that effect. And hey, we were sniping at each other. Let's be honest. I mean, I saw it in Europe. I saw it within the EU. I saw it between Europe and the United States on a number of occasions. We were sniping at each other, and that
focus now.
Not going to stop forever, but it's certainly stopped now.
Yep. Yeah. I think one of the tests for a dictator is how long of a table can you get. Right, because you see the table, and he's sitting like 9 miles away from his generals or whatever. That was an unbelievable
shuffleboard in a bar,
I couldn't believe that. That was really crazy.
Oh my god.
Yeah. Well, by the way, that's another. I mean, who knows? This could be wishful thinking on people's part, but there's a lot of question about. Excuse me. Is Vladimir Putin well?
Yeah.
I mean, his face looks puffy. Is he taking cortisone? Is it, what's going on there? And then that long table begs the question of, is he somehow immunocompromised and very worried about anything that, but what it also reinforces is how very isolated he is.
Yeah. Isn't that something?
I mean, he's not even at the Kremlin, he's an hour outside of Moscow. He doesn't go in there. He doesn't have regular meetings of his advisors. The extent he meets, it's, there, maybe a handful of people that see him. There's sort of former KGB cronies and his advisors, and particularly anybody who has a sense of what's going on in the rest of the world. They're kind of isolated from him, or he's isolated from them. And that's also worrisome in terms of ultimately what decisions he might make. But it's a factor. And people have, we all laugh at the table, but there's also a question of why.
Yeah.
Not why are we laughing, but why is he doing it? Why is he doing this? Is there something else underneath that we're not focused on?
Going on, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we can even take the pulse of this, but I saw a question come through our feed here, like how isolated is he from his people? What do the Russian people by and large think about this? Are there any polls that we can rely on as to what they're thinking?
Well, it's hard. What I've seen, you'll be sorry to hear, that over 70% of the Russian people are like fully on board of this. Why?
Still?
Here's what they've been told. This is, this is Ukrainians attacking Russians. They're committing genocide against, literally. This is what he says: committing genocide against Russians in the Donbass area in particular. They're very. They started this. We're going in to protect the Russian people. And the Americans have, worked this up, and those Americans, they're going to hit us with chemical weapons. And of course, we know Russia may well use chemical weapons. And so, but this is all they're hearing. And Putin's thing about, the greatest tragedy of the 20th century is dissolution of the USSR. Most Russians would agree with that. Now, there's sort of a demographic, the older Russians who are sort of used to living in the system and all, they're going to buy it. Younger Russians who are much more cosmopolitan, who are much better wired in a sense of getting information from the outside, social media, that kind of thing, to the extent it hasn't been shut down already. They know what's going on. And you see a lot of them trying to leave, and a lot of them concerning. And clearly something has to be going on there, or he wouldn't have given that speech this morning about
that's a good point.
Cleansing Russia, right?
What do you call them? Traitors or something?
Traitors.
Yeah. Traitors. Yeah. Wow. Crazy.
Well, speaking of social media, can you talk a little bit about the role that social media, Google Maps, and all of this instant information sharing? I'm watching videos on TikTok of Ukrainians making Molotov cocktails. Like, I'm watching this in real time, I think, to the degree that that's all accurate. So, what role has that played? And is war kind of changed forever as a result of this instant information?
Well, yeah. I mean, remember the Vietnam War changed with television. And the you don't remember because you're too young, but I do. And by the way, I was just in junior high school myself, but I've been told.
I've read a history book.
Yeah, exactly. But what happened in Vietnam, and one reason you had such opposition to the Vietnam War was it was like right there in your face every night on television. And I think social media has taken that dynamic and put it on steroids.
Yeah.
And so what it means is people are getting much more information than they otherwise would have available to them. The military can use it. in terms of what's going on in a particular community, and they believe me, they track it. As you suggest, Google Maps, things like that. I mean, you don't, you turn on Waze and find out where you're going. You're not sitting there looking at a map
Right.
and going like this. And so, there's no question that technology of social media has changed the face of warfare and brings it to the world in real time. There's a downside to social media, and that is, unfortunately, it's very easily manipulated, not so much in this context, but for sure in the informational context, in the lead up to all this. And Russia, unfortunately, has become quite adept at using social media to try to sow dissent, not just within and among, Russians or crush dissent too, but here in our country. And I mean, I read something, or not read, but I was told by our intelligence services while I was ambassador, as an example, that at one point there was and this got traced back to Russia. At one point there was, it was either a police shooting or some kind of gun-related incident in either Houston or Dallas, Texas. And all of a sudden these, I guess at that time it was Facebook and maybe Twitter went out to people who clearly were, anti-gun folks, right? Come to, I'm making this up, First and Main at noon on Monday for a rally against gun violence. The same time, all the, Second Amendment crowd got a different thing. Come to First and Main at noon on Monday for a protest in favor of Second Amendment rights.
Wow.
Looking for trouble. And what happened was
kidding.
the police chief and the mayor were notified of that. They did a big media campaign. This is not happening. And they actually, blocked it off so you couldn't have something like that. But I mean, that's the kind of thing that they do. And the other problem with social media, honestly, is the algorithms work in a way that they really limit our ability to see both sides of an issue.
Right.
It's like if you link something or like something, you're going to get more of that and not the other thing. I intentionally will link or like things that are, ideologically different from maybe what I believe, because I want to see what are all sides saying.
Interesting.
Good for you.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
It's a hard thing to
do. You'll be shocked when you see what you get. It's also the annoying thing, like you actually look online to buy something, and then every time you go online, ads for that thing pop up.
Yeah. I already bought the socks. I don't need to see 7 more ads.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. I don't
that's
need
scary.
those
Most of
shorts anymore.
Yeah. You want to ask about the helpers?
Yeah, one last question. So, Mr. Rogers always said, look for the helpers in a time of tragedy. So who are, ending on a positive note here, who are the helpers of Ukraine? What should folks who want to get engaged and do something useful, what should they be looking at? How do you know what's a good resource or not?
Well, I'll tell you, as the son and grandson of Presbyterian ministers, and Mr. Rogers started out as a Presbyterian minister.
He did?
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that.
Always happy to hear him, raised there. And what's extraordinary about this is not just the Ukrainian people, but the Poles, the Moldovans, and then of course I think Europe in general, Hungarians, all reaching out and helping and taking. I mean, the Poles have taken in over 2.5 million refugees. Wow. They're pretty much at their limit. You remember what a fuss Germany made when Germans took in 1.5 million. That's a country of 85 million people. Took in 1.5 million refugees back in 2015, 2016 with the Syrian crisis. Ultimately ended up being about 900,000. I mean, that almost destroyed Merkel's career. Here the Poles are willingly, in a much smaller country, bringing these folks in. I think it's absolutely extraordinary. And there's a lot of resources that are going to Ukraine. There are a lot of organizations popping up that we could help. But I think there are a lot of organizations that help with refugee resettlement. I'll tell you, when this happened in Germany, I was ambassador and I went to some of the centers, and I mean, it's a logistical nightmare. I mean, you got to process people, identify them. Who are they? Then, the worst thing in the world is just keep them all piled up, try to disperse them throughout the country, get places for them to stay, ultimately jobs for them to work at. It requires a lot, and I think that the helpers are they're in some instances governments, in some instances companies, but in a lot of instances just real people who decide, hey, I'll take somebody in, I'll come down and feed, I'll feed folks, I'll drive people around, whatever it is. It's really really extraordinary. And there are a lot of organizations popping up. Obviously, there's probably, it's sad to say, but in every there's a criminal element that will make things up to try to get money. But I'm confident there are websites like maybe USAID, which is part of the State Department, and I know very deeply involved in trying to help people, or very credible organizations like Doctors Without Borders, or obviously the Red Cross, or organizations that do this. And they'll want the money themselves, but maybe they also will have on their website. These are smaller organizations that we've vetted and improved, and your $200 contribution can go a long way towards helping someone there. So, I mean, we're doing that ourselves in my family, and looking for ways to contribute. And I think that's super important. And there's some really wonderful, wonderful people out there who are, in many instances, risking their lives
for sure
to help folks.
For sure, absolutely.
That's a wonderful story. That's a great story. When humanity,
it's very heartwarming to see.
Yeah.
John, one more question. This came from the audience. Is Russia going to be like a perpetual failed state now, like North Korea, or can they come back from this?
Well, I think it depends. I think as long as Putin decides to continue down this path, rather than relatively quickly agree to some sort of a settlement and start pulling back and ceasing this bombardment of civilians. But even if he does that, I think as long as Vladimir Putin's in charge, probably right. I think you're going to need ultimately, certainly a change in attitude, a change in approach, and probably a change in government. And and by the way, Russian government, who knows? You could get somebody worse, right? So
I know that's true.
Some kind of a change before that happens. But it's Russia could they're going to be in a different place in North Korea because they actually do have resources that the rest of the world wants.
Good point. Yeah.
But apart from Kim Jong-un haircuts, but but I think that they could become just a little brother to China, which I'm sure.
Interesting.
Here Vladimir Putin wanted to make Russia great again, and now look what's happening.
Oh my gosh!
Pretty amazing.
Little brother with some big guns.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I mean that's not at all what they want. But I mean that's could be well where they're headed, which is sad given where we could have been.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. John, how can people follow you if they want to hear what you're like on social media?
Oh,
what you're thinking.
I'm not that good at posting on social media.
You're not? Okay.
My Twitter is John BMO, or at John BMO EMO, but I'm honestly not. I do so much of this. I just kind of do it this way, but but I'm not a big social media guy. My kids are much better at that than I am. I do have a daughter who was in the Hunger Games movie.
Really?
Oh, really?
He has a big following.
Which character?
Foxface.
No way.
That's your daughter?
Yeah. Jackie.
How
Hamilton.
awesome.
That's great. Congratulations. That's
I
exciting.
enjoyed those. I enjoyed that story.
Yeah.
And we have identical twins who do some TikTok stuff, but they're now doing, they're all posting on this and everything. But
sure.
And of course, Capital Group has a web page and feeds and lots of webinars about the investment implications of all this as well. People are invited to that.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And we
the American funds, funds as well.
American funds. Most of we have a lot of our clients are in the American funds, and we really appreciate your Capital Group and the American funds for giving you to us to be able to interview you, and we appreciate your expertise and your wisdom and your kindness and generosity and being able to spend time with us. Thank you so very
Well,
much.
and let me just say thank you guys, because I think, in today's world, even in these kinds of shows, they end up getting so hard bitten and partisan one way or the other, right? And here you guys are just trying to bring the truth to people.
Yep.
And bring a balanced perspective. And I think, honestly, just the way you two interact with one another and with your viewers, it's a great lesson for all of us to take away about how we should treat one another. So
well, thank you.
Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Back at
Ambassador John Emerson, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks a lot.
Appreciate that. So,
next time,
right?
yeah.
Oh my gosh, that was so fun.
That was amazing.
So next time?
Yes, next time we will have Kirsten Howe on the show. She is a wonderful local estate planning attorney, and we're going to be talking about some of the fundamentals of estate planning, like, do you need a will, and where do you get one, and what do you put in it?
Yeah.
So that's
what
going to
about a trust, and what kind of trust do I need, and
right.
all that stuff, right? She's an expert on in advanced planning as well, so she's going to bring, and she's also going to talk about some of the latest things on the horizon that may be coming our way. We almost had a big, giant, transformational thing that happened, and Joe Manchin prevented that from occurring with respect to estate taxes.
Yeah.
So with the Build Back
I'm
Better
sure they're
plan,
going to keep coming.
I'm sure they will.
It.
It's not going to go away.
Yeah.
So anyway, look forward to that. That'll be in 2 weeks, and we also want to let you know that we still have our offer for the Endless Inheritance free book. There it is. That we wrote. This is about how to protect your family from disintegrating, basically, like we hope Ukraine doesn't do, and the Russian economy is doing right now. We don't want to have that happen to your family. And also, we have 30-minute free consultations with either Angela or I or both. And you can go to our website and at aplaceofpossibility.com to be able to get sign up for those. And finally, of course, if you have any questions at all.
Yes. Requests for topics also. Please let us know what you want to hear about on the show. We would love to love to deliver for you.
And you can reach us at info@aplaceofpossibility.com. So, hope that was entertaining for you and informative. I learned a lot.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, you're invested, and so are we. Take care.